The Korean War was a brutal conflict that ravaged the Korean Peninsula from 1950 to 1953. It was a proxy war, fueled by the ideological tensions of the Cold War. Two superpowers, the United States, supporting the South, and the Soviet Union backing the North, clashed indirectly. This conflict had devastating consequences for the Korean people and left a lasting impact on global politics. The war's roots lay in the aftermath of World War II. Korea, previously under Japanese rule, was divided along the 38th parallel. The Soviet Union occupied the North and the United States the South. This division sowed the seeds of political and ideological discord. In 1950, tensions erupted into open warfare when North Korean forces, under the leadership of Kim Il-sung, launched a surprise invasion of the South. The United States, fearing the spread of communism, intervened militarily under the auspices of the United Nations. The Korean War was a tragedy for all involved. It resulted in millions of casualties, both military and civilian. The war also solidified the division of the Korean Peninsula, leaving a legacy of political tension and mistrust that continues to this day. Following World War II, the Korean Peninsula, which had been under Japanese rule since 1910, found itself at a significant crossroads. The end of the war marked the beginning of a new era for Korea, but it was not the era of independence that many Koreans had hoped for. The defeat of Japan in the war created a power vacuum that the Allied victors sought to fill. The surrender of Japan was a momentous event, but it also left Korea in a state of uncertainty and vulnerability. Korea, however, was not granted immediate independence. Instead, it was divided along the 38th parallel, a line arbitrarily drawn by the victorious Allied powers. This division was meant to be a temporary administrative measure, but it soon became a permanent and defining feature of the Korean Peninsula. The Soviet Union assumed control of the North, while the United States took responsibility for the South. This division was not just a geographical one, it represented the beginning of a deep ideological split that would shape the future of Korea. This division, intended as a temporary measure to oversee the surrender of Japanese forces, quickly evolved into a focal point of Cold War rivalry. The Korean Peninsula became a microcosm of the larger global struggle between communism and capitalism. The two superpowers, each suspicious of the other's intentions, began to establish their respective spheres of influence in Korea. The North and South were not just divided by a line on a map, but by competing visions for the future of the Korean people. The Soviets, under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, supported the communist aspirations of Kim Il-sung, a Korean nationalist and guerrilla leader who had fought against the Japanese during the war. Kim Il-sung's rise to power was emblematic of the broader Soviet strategy in the region. Kim Il-sung became the premier of the newly established Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north. His leadership marked the beginning of a new era for North Korea, one that would be defined by its alignment with Soviet communism. In the south, the United States backed Syngman Rhee, an anti-communist leader who had spent years in exile during the Japanese occupation. Rhee's return to Korea was seen as a triumph for those who opposed communism and sought a different path for the nation. Rhee became the president of the Republic of Korea in 1948. His presidency marked the establishment of a government that was aligned with Western democratic ideals and opposed to the communist regime in the north. The division of Korea, once a unified nation with a shared history and culture, was now a stark reality. The hopes for a unified, independent Korea were dashed, and the peninsula was set on a path of division and conflict that would have lasting repercussions for its people. The division of Korea along ideological lines mirrored the broader global struggle between communism and capitalism, the defining conflict of the Cold War. The United States, guided by the Truman Doctrine of containing the spread of communism, viewed the Korean Peninsula as a critical battleground in this ideological struggle. The Soviet Union, under Stalin's leadership, saw an opportunity to expand its sphere of influence in Asia. The establishment of a communist regime in North Korea aligned with Soviet strategic interests in the region. Both superpowers provided military and economic aid to their respective Korean allies, exacerbating tensions on the peninsula. The situation in Korea became increasingly volatile in the late 1940s. Border clashes between North and South Korean forces became more frequent and intense. Both Kim Il-sung in the north and Syngman Rhee in the south, harbored ambitions of unifying the peninsula under their respective rule. The United States, preoccupied with events in Europe, initially underestimated the seriousness of the situation in Korea. However, the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War in 1949 and the subsequent establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong heightened American anxieties about the spread of communism in Asia. Section 4, North Korean Offensive, a nation divided by war. On June 25, 1950, the simmering tensions on the Korean peninsula erupted into full-scale war. The conflict had been brewing for years, with both North and South Korea claiming to be the legitimate government of the entire peninsula. The division of Korea at the 38th parallel after World War II had set the stage for this inevitable clash. North Korean forces, armed with Soviet-supplied tanks and artillery, launched a surprise attack across the 38th parallel into South Korea. The North Korean military, well-trained and equipped, moved with precision and speed, catching the South Korean forces off guard. The invasion marked the beginning of a brutal conflict that would engulf the peninsula for the next 3 years. The initial phase of the war saw intense fighting, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The landscape of Korea, with its rugged terrain and harsh weather conditions, added to the challenges faced by the combatants. The North Korean People's Army made rapid advances southward, capturing the South Korean capital of Seoul within days. The fall of Seoul was a significant blow to the South Korean government and its military, leading to widespread panic and chaos. The South Korean army, ill-prepared and outmatched, offered fierce but ultimately ineffective resistance. Despite their determination, they lacked the necessary resources and support to halt the North Korean advance. The situation seemed dire, with the possibility of a complete North Korean takeover looming large. The United States, caught off guard by the invasion, responded swiftly. Recognizing the strategic importance of Korea in the broader context of the Cold War, American leaders knew they had to act decisively to prevent the spread of communism in Asia. President Harry S. Truman, fearing the fall of South Korea to communism, committed American military forces to the conflict. In a decisive move, he ordered U.S. air and naval forces to support South Korea, marking the beginning of a significant American military involvement in the region. The United Nations Security Council, with the Soviet Union notably absent and therefore unable to exercise its veto power, condemned the North Korean invasion and authorized a U.S.-led military intervention under the UN flag. This decision marked a rare moment of unity among the Western powers, who saw the conflict as a critical test of their resolve against communist expansion. The Korean War quickly escalated into a major international conflict. Nations from around the world, including the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and Turkey, sent troops to support the UN effort, turning the Korean peninsula into a battleground for global ideologies. American troops, along with contingents from other UN member states, poured into Korea to support the South Korean army. The arrival of these reinforcements provided a much-needed boost to the beleaguered South Korean forces, allowing them to regroup and mount a counteroffensive. The conflict, initially a civil war between North and South Korea, transformed into a proxy war between the United States and its allies and the Communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union and China. The involvement of these superpowers added a new dimension to the war, making it a critical front in the global struggle between communism and democracy. The Korean War would leave an indelible mark on the history of the 20th century, shaping the geopolitical landscape for decades to come. Section 5. The Incheon Landing, Turning the Tide. By September 1950, North Korean forces had pushed the South Korean and UN forces to the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula, around the city of Busan. The North Korean People's Army had advanced rapidly, overwhelming the South Korean and UN troops with their sheer numbers and firepower. The situation for the South appeared dire. Civilians were gripped with fear, and the morale of the troops was at an all-time low. The Busan perimeter was the last stand, a desperate defensive line that had to hold at all costs. However, a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, a strategic port city on the west coast of Korea, dramatically altered the course of the war. This operation was not just a military maneuver, but a beacon of hope for the beleaguered forces and civilians alike. The Incheon landing, planned and executed under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of UN forces, was a risky but ultimately successful gamble. MacArthur's audacity and strategic brilliance were on full display as he orchestrated this complex operation. MacArthur, known for his bold and often controversial strategies, believed that a surprise attack behind enemy lines would catch the North Koreans off guard and cut off their supply lines. His plan involved navigating treacherous tides and narrow channels, making the operation extremely perilous. On September 15, 1950, UN forces stormed ashore at Incheon, facing fierce resistance from the North Korean defenders. The initial landings were met with heavy gunfire, and the terrain was challenging, but the determination of the UN forces was unwavering. The landing, however, succeeded in catching the North Koreans by surprise. The element of surprise was crucial, as it disrupted the North Korean command structure and created chaos within their ranks. The UN forces, supported by naval bombardments and air power, secured the city and began to advance rapidly inland. The combined arms approach, utilizing sea, air, and land forces, proved to be a decisive factor in the success of the operation. The Incheon landing was a turning point in the Korean War. It marked the beginning of a series of offensives that would eventually push the North Korean forces back across the 38th parallel. It relieved pressure on the beleaguered UN and South Korean forces in the south and forced the North Korean army to retreat northward in disarray. The psychological impact of this victory was immense, boosting the morale of the UN and South Korean troops. The success at Incheon emboldened MacArthur and led to a shift in war aims from containment to rollback, with the goal of unifying Korea under a non-communist government. This shift in strategy would have far-reaching implications for the future of the Korean Peninsula and the broader Cold War context.